And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for the warm welcome. And people ask me many times, they still ask me since I've left politics, what are the main things you notice that are different? And my colleagues who are here will certainly note that when you stand up, it's nice to be introduced, stand up, start to speak, and there's warm applause, because in fact in the House of Commons, it does not unfold that way. You stand up, you get heckled and jeered and even booed. Those are just your own colleagues. Then there's the opposition. So it's a very different thing. So we do appreciate that. I do, however, because I've experienced it firsthand for many years, know the pressures and the demands on elected people, and to come to a function like this with everything else that you have going on today is significant. So for those who are elected among us, just raise your hand so that we can acknowledge you. And there we go, a number of our elected representatives here. Thanks so much. We appreciate very much everything you do. We in Canada, we have a sense that we have things to share with the world. And in Canada, I would suggest we are seen by people around the world as being somewhat humble. As a matter of fact, as you know, as Canadians, we are very proud of our humility. We talk about it wherever we go. And if we talk about it too much, we underline it by saying, I'm sorry. So when we look at what we can be doing with and among and for other nations, I believe it's really important for us to pause just for a second and consider how we approach other nations, how we approach our neighbors, because we do have a sense that we have a lot of things figured out. And in fact, and I don't say this in a pejorative sense at all, we're still working on a number of things. And it's very important for us to be considering that attitude as we look to our relationships with other nations. I want to touch on 5 specific points in which I believe we have something to offer, 5 areas when it comes to our beautiful relationships we have with the Turkic community around the world. But as we do that, I think it's important that we recognize that in fact we may not be as, sometimes we think we're more advanced in so many of these areas than other nations. In fact, we may not be. People do look at us with some wonder and awe in light of the fact that we consider ourselves to be a peaceful people, a friendly people, a quiet people. And they don't understand, or many times we have people saying, how is it that Canada sort of is able to project itself this way? Well, first, just let me underline historically that when it comes time to stand up and be involved in the great conflicts of the world, we have done so in significant ways. And at considerable sacrifice and a considerable loss. But why are we not as combative maybe as other nations seem to be? We have figured out a secret. It's a one-word secret. It's an ancient channeling process. It's a channeling of the spirit. It's a channeling of the energy. And in one word, it is called hockey. We like to think we invented it. I don't know if we did, but we certainly perfected this Zen channel. And we can, as Canadians, focus all our frustrations, all our hostilities onto the ice surface. And it's an amazing thing. We either engage in it personally or we watch it, and following that there is a peace that settles over the land. You can be watching a game, and before the game starts, you can be fired up and feeling very aggressive and combative, and when the game is over, it's all peace. You step outside, you see your neighbor, you see that his dog has just paused on your lawn, but it's okay. The game is over, and you speak peace to your neighbor. As a matter of fact, as a true Canadian, you say, I'm sorry that my lawn was in the way of your dog. And this is how we have learned to project ourselves. But when we look at the unique, I believe, opportunities and challenges we have, the challenges that affect not just Canada, but in fact are affecting us internationally. And we look to the Turkic nations, we realize, I think we first need to, before we touch on these 5 areas that I want to mention, we just need to realize we're actually not first in the game. in any of these areas. We want to talk to, or I certainly like to talk to leaders in other countries, and I'm involved with some groups that do that. And for instance, economic policy. Before we rush to do that with our Turkic nation friends, let's remember it was the Turkic people who actually invented the first minted coinage. And that was thousands of years ago. We're coming late to the game on this. So if we have certain ideas, and we do, on economic policy, let's approach, as we share those, let's approach those in a way which understands that our Turkic friends have been there a long time before we have. As a matter of fact, as those of you who are students of words and their origins know that the word Turk, the root of that, is actually beginning. That's actually what it means. Turkic people were there at the beginning of some of the very issues that we want to, in fact, export because we think we have perfected them. When it comes to talking to other nations, Turkic nations, and we hear comments on this, and we should do this, but sharing about the importance of constitutional law and the written law and the rule of law, we just pause for a minute and realize it was Turkic people who actually were the first ones to invent writing, period. Before cuneiform, there was runiform, which has in its very roots are Turkic. When we want to talk about, we think that we, and in many ways Canada is a leader when it comes to trade, but when we are sharing what we believe are the imperatives about trade and how amazing trade can be to the economies of all countries, the Turkic people pretty well invented it. I mean, we can talk about the Phoenicians and go back that far, but go back further and talk about the trade routes that were established by those peoples that we know now to be Turkic people. These are areas in which, as we reach out to share and to become partners, we are talking with people who have been on this road for a very long time. And as elected people, you know, we in Canada, as we know, and I hear that slight rumbling there. I was in the last session before lunch. By the way, I think we should just give a special round of applause to the presenters in that last session. That was amazing. Their concentration was not broken, and neither was the audience, though it sounded like you know, the whole building was coming down. So can we give another hand for those? And so, ladies and gentlemen, as those of us here in this room as Canadians, as we look to, in a well-meaning way, reach out and extend what we've learned, let's do it with that caution and with that realization that we're talking with people who've been doing this for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And we'll ask them to forgive us as elected people. We have our own hopes and dreams, and we like to rush into the fray. And as we understand and we do this study on words and their meaning, actually the word politics has its Turkic roots. Poly meaning many, and ticks being annoying little insects. So we need to talk about and look about exactly how we're projecting ourselves as we believe we have the answers. I do think we have the answers that we have found out from difficult lessons on our own. But we approach that with the respect that comes with dealing with people who have walked this path for many, many centuries. And so when I talk about, first of all, in the area that I believe is of prime importance and something where we can share together, but it's basically for our country and for the Turkic nations. When we say Turkic nations, we always immediately think of Turkey, but we know it goes far beyond that. We're talking, depending on your estimations, anywhere from 175 million to 200 million people around the world with Turkic roots who have that DNA of wanting to have peace and wanting to have prosperity. And those roots are spread around the world, which offers a tremendous advantage. And when we look at this first area related to security, we have some things in common. Sometimes, and as we heard, and quite rightly, the grieving accounts of what has happened in recent terrorist attacks in Turkey and in other Turkic nations, people tend to think sometimes that Canada is absolved of those. We're not. We have had recent tragedies in that regard, as you know, on Parliament Hill and in the province of Quebec. We have had terrorist attacks in provinces years ago where elected person was killed. We have had martial law in Canada. We have had, up to its point of time before 9/11, the largest ever terrorist attack in terms of fatalities on Canadians being the Air India disaster, which was the largest ever attack in North America related to terrorism. We know in Canada the pain, we know the necessity to be doing all we can to protect our own people, and we know the challenges being affected and being brought into Turkic nations that are dealing with this area of security. We know what it is to battle the forces of ISIL, as our Turkic nation friends know. There is an imperative for us to be sharing in an appropriate way our intelligence services and our military capabilities, where appropriate, according to the desires and the wishes of the people of each nation. And there's the challenge for us as democratic countries is that we do this in a way where we can keep it nonpartisan, where we can forcefully say we should be doing this and we should be doing that. But when we're talking about security, the goal should always be the protection, the safety and security of our people, and to go beyond the partisanship and then talk about what can we actually do to link arms with other countries that are facing these similar challenges. The need, the ability, and the imperative to be sharing along these lines is absolutely key. And then we can talk about, as a secondary, we can talk about governance. In Canada, we think, and I think there's some degree of truth, that we have discovered great truths and principles about good governance. And basically, in our founding, the throes of our founding formations, post First Nations, we really had to deal with a couple of competing philosophical bases to come up with our present area of our present capabilities of governance. We had the roots of France and what was gone through for a number of centuries there, and Great Britain, and then how that evolved into influences we get from the United States. You may notice there's some differences in for instance, presidential races that go on in the United States as opposed to prime ministerial races in Canada. Before we, again, think too much of ourselves in terms of Canadians thinking they handle themselves perhaps better in our races, as robust as those can be, are you aware that during our federal election last year, more Canadians on television watched the U.S. debates than watched the Canadian debates? So it's good to be circumspect about where we're headed and what we're looking at. But we have some things to share related to governance. And yet again, it's so important that we remember what our Turkic friends have in terms of experience, good and bad, on the issue of governance. The Turkic Council, which was formed, I believe, 3 or 4 years ago, needs to be congratulated because those Turkic nations have embraced the United Nations, the principles of the United Nations. They've embraced democracy and human rights. When the president of Kazakhstan last year was speaking at that conference, he was talking about drawing from the years of experience in governance that those Turkic nations had, and he talked about the 550 years of experience they have. In Canada, we're quite excited because we're coming up to 150. So when we talk about and want to share what we have learned related to governance, let's do it with that context in mind, that we are talking to people who have seen every mode of governance imaginable, some good and some not so good. Some which had some of the very principles of democracy that were found and flowed from Greece in the early days. Some who've been under the horrific communist rule, some under Nazi rule, some under good governments, some under not so good governments. So it's not just a matter of us taking a model that we think we've perfected and say, here, do it this way. Different models can work at different times, but those principles we can share together. And we can embrace nations like Kazakhstan and their president when they talk about wanting to seize these elements of human rights and other areas in the United Nations and embrace those and see us move ahead together in areas when it comes to governance. And then we can talk, and Canadians rightly should, and we do talk about what we do related to immigration. The last several years we've seen our immigration levels at unprecedented high levels, 250,000, 260,000 a year, unprecedented levels of refugee admission. Yet when we look alone, just at Turkey alone, in what they have done to try and relieve crises related to people fleeing from disastrous areas of the world. Turkey alone, never mind the other Turkic nations, is actually way ahead of us in terms of the sheer numbers. We can work in a number of ways to help that. And again, I would say to my Canadian political friends, as far as we possibly can, we need to do this in non-partisan ways. These are areas, yes, there'll always be differences, but let's work together to help the Turkic nations who are under huge pressures to alleviate some of those pressures, and at the same time learn from them in how they have dealt with massive amounts of immigration. And you want to talk about diversity, the Turkic nations. I mean, every religion you can imagine, every walk of life, every ethnic profile that you can think of, embraced within Turkic nations. So as we reach out to help in these areas of integrating people into our societies, and we think we've got all the answers as Canadians, we're actually going to, and we do, learn from our neighbors on this particular score. And then when it comes to dealing with our neighbors themselves, we talk about the challenges of dealing with the large neighbor to the north, to the south, and I'm not talking about Mexico. Just think in terms of the Turkic community down through the ages and the issues with their neighbors. Just think today of the issues of Turkic nations with China, and yet having large Turkic communities within China. I believe one of the secrets of moving to get to the heads of government, especially in non-democratic nations. You know, in non-democratic nations, they're still very sensitive to what the public is thinking and saying. And to a degree, they will. There are checks and balances today in the nation of China. I can tell you, a non-democratic country, but very sensitive to where public opinion can go. I believe there's great opportunity through these great repositories of Turkic people around the world. There is the ability for a flow of information, but also of encouragement to have those Turkic communities from within some of what we would call the challenged neighborhoods, bringing some of the public sentiment to rise that leads to better governance, in many cases, at levels that may not be reflecting that right now. Think of Iran. Canada is dealing with issues, as many countries are, related to Iran. But think of this. 15 million people in Iran of strong Turkic descent. People who understand the challenges of life. People who know what it is to hope for peace and to want to see peace. And think of the effect as we work with representative nations and the very DNA of that large group of people, getting information, getting assistance, getting encouragement to bring forward, even in a nation that may not be as democratic as ours, bring forward the types of principles that actually can get through to and start to affect the leadership. We can learn about dealing with neighbors from dealing with the people of the world who've dealt with neighbors of a variety of sources more than anybody we can, almost anybody we can think of, and that is the Turkic people. And then finally, in the area of trade, we believe, Canadians believe, and we know, we simply can manufacture and grow and produce more than we can consume. And so we learned early on, if we are going to be a prosperous people and raise our standard of living, we have to be free trading people. When we shared these realities, and I can remember opening our trade office and our new embassy in Kazakhstan several years ago, and then being back there last year, I was amazed. I was stunned by the growth, by the advancements in technology, by the increase in the standard of living. Perfect? No. Incredibly better? Yes, almost immeasurably better from what I'd seen a short 7 years before. A city, a modern city, more modern than most Canadian cities, had sprung up where once there was, as we would say in Western Canada, the bald prairie. And why? Because of trade. And trade principally in two areas. We think we've discovered everything about agriculture. The Turkic people and the Turkic nations from hundreds of years ago were the ones to develop some of the greatest advances in agriculture. They were feeding the world before being overtaken by various forces. And what's the principal product that has raised the standard of living among certainly the people of Kazakhstan and many of the other Stan nations, as we call them? It's natural resources. Now, some people automatically want to recoil when we say that because then we think of the environment. Ladies and gentlemen, you may be aware that between China and India alone, those two nations have on the drawing board, not what they're existing already, they are now in the process of planning and building 1,500, count it, 1,500 new coal-fired plants, just to provide the energy sources to raise their own people out of poverty. 1,500 coal-fired plants. And yet here are the Turkic nations of the world, Kazakhstan being one of the leaders, with natural resources to be able to give an alternative. That's just to two nations, just to China and India. Natural resources, properly handled, properly produced, properly transported. I appreciate all the concerns related to pipelines, and we need to be careful of those in every country in which they exist. But folks, these, our Turkic nations and friends, are struggling with the same things we are in this area. Natural resources which will lower the overall carbon footprint in the atmosphere by replacing the potential of thousands of coal-fired plants. We need to work together with our Turkic friends in these areas. And then finally, in the development of the Silk Road, and I've been honored last year to have been invited to China to give presentations on the Silk Road, which has nothing to do with Canada. But this amazing road, this corridor that is being developed, not in the future, it's being developed now. From the far reaches of northern China, all the way down into the far reaches of Europe. It's an amazing multi-trillion-dollar project which will bring trade, prosperity, the demand for technology, the demand for skills, the demand for the proper extraction of the products. I mean, just think of building the rail lines themselves and the highways. The opportunities are fantastic. And Canadian companies who understand what it is to live in cold weather environments and to build products that can be sustainable in those environments have much to offer in working with our Turkic nation friends who basically established the Silk Road only about 2,500 years ago, before we even thought of it. Ladies and gentlemen, we have great opportunity working together. I have just touched on 5 areas. As we keep in mind our attitude, as we keep in mind that we have learned some lessons the hard way, that we have things to share with our Turkic friends, our nation, and the Turkic people in many of these nations. And with a commitment to do that, we can literally together be changing the world. You know, the Turkic people, if there was a color for the Turkic people that they themselves chose, a certain type of blue, a gorgeous blue, that manifested in whether it's the artwork or the jewelry over the centuries. And when we in Canada think of blue, we think of blue sky. We think of good future. The French even noticed that with their early explorers. I mean, the word turquoise, turquoise, c'est un mot francophone, c'est pas anglophone. Et les sujets que nous avons discutés ici aujourd'hui dans votre congrès sont si importants pour l'amélioration des problèmes pour nous comme Canadiens et Canadiennes, mais pour tout le monde. That blue sky, that turquoise, that Turkish approach, which actually believes in opportunity and hope, is there for us. I close with the final root translation of the word Anatolia. As you know, it means east, but it reflects on the sunrise. It talks about the sunrise. Now, for political reasons, I'm almost constrained to say sunny ways. But folks, there's something there. And it's something that the Turkic people have looked for and moved towards, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively, all their lives. The sunrise that awaits, the warm bask of sunlight in what are now dark problems in Turkic nations and in ours, the darkness can be pushed away by this approach, the very roots of which are in the Turkic people themselves. Thank you very much for being here today.